Every January, I get the privilege of taking students from the chilly mid-Atlantic and head to the sunny Bahamas where we learn about subtropical ecology. One of my favorite days on the trip is when we explore a mangrove tidal creek. I have been working with mangroves for the past decade, so here's our exploration and some knowledge for you.
All right, so we're in a mangrove tidal creek, okay? And so creeks, as we think of them in the States, are tributaries to streams and rivers. That's not how they work here in the Bahamas. During high tide, water is flowing in, right? And then at peak, it'll turn and then flow out. So right now we're leaning towards a low tide, right? And so the water is moving out. So the flow is in and out. What that does is recharges the creek with new fresh ocean water, and that water, as it heats up and dehydrates, will actually become saltier, particularly at low tide. So the recharge is really important. It also brings in fresh water, fresh nutrients for the plant life and things in here. And it's kind of a cyclical pattern that happens twice a day.
So here's a view of the creek halfway upstream. At high tide, this entire area is flooded, including all the areas where the mangrove trees are. But whether the tide is coming in or out, a majority of the water flows like a creek through the middle.
So you can tell the height of the high tide based on the algal growth on the stilts. So you can see here we're really at low tide. Common thing we'll see on the mangrove creek floor: mermaid's wine glass.
At the peak of low tide, Up Creek looks like a mud flat.
All right, we're here at the back of a creek at low tide. If you look down, there's no water, but there is a lot of mud because you can't see my feet anymore. This is where the heart of that carbon storing is happening. This mud is full of organic matter, and a lot of the decomposition only happens at the surface where there's oxygen because of the bacteria that break it down. So a lot of it doesn't get broken down, it's below the surface. Very mucky, can be very smelly at times, but the most valuable part of the creek in terms of carbon storage.
At the perimeter of many of these tidal creeks, you'll find porous and sharp limestone that has been darkened by the sun. Not fun to walk on without shoes. I'm always amazed by these little mangrove seedlings growing in the rock.
So what makes something a mangrove species, right? So that's just a general term, but that's any tree species or woody species that spends part of its time underwater or inundated in salt water, right? So because they're spending time underwater, they have to have mechanisms to breathe, right? So while plants do take in carbon dioxide through their leaves, their respiration actually happens in the root systems. So that oxygen taking in, right? So they have to be able to do that when they're underwater. And there's two kind of mechanisms for that here in the Bahamas. The black mangrove, which we see right there, uses these structures sticking out of the ground. Does anybody know what they're called? Nematophores, right. And they act like a snorkel, right? They stick above the water surface at high tide and are able to do gas exchange. Now, red mangroves don't have that. That's what this is, a rhizophora species. They have little pores on their stilt roots called lenticels, which function sort of like a stomata in a leaf to exchange gases, right? So when the tide comes in and they're inundated, they're still able to breathe. Now, in the Bahamas, there's essentially 4 species associated with the mangrove community. You have your red mangroves, your black mangroves. Sometimes you'll see, very seldomly, a white mangrove species. And then there's a species called buttonbush that's also associated with it. So the mangroves in the Bahamas, the diversity of mangroves is pretty low. Most of the islands are covered in red and black mangroves, as opposed to the Eastern Hemisphere, where you're going to see 40 to 50 different tree species that are in that ecosystem. Now, the research has shown, based on genetic analysis, that all the red mangroves in the Bahamas actually migrated from Africa. So the propagules, the seeds, the living seeds that float across the ocean, have actually floated across the Atlantic and settled in the Caribbean. And as a result, we only have 1 species of red mangrove, and the diversity is fairly low, which makes them very prone to disease and dieback from fungal species and things like that. So how do we tell red and blacks apart? Well, reds do have those large reddish stilts, propagative roots. When you're looking at the leaves, though, they're very different. So the rhizophora, the red mangroves, have this longer leaf, more elliptical, whereas the black mangroves leaves are a lot shorter, a little rounder, and often have this silvery white underside. That is salt residue that's collected from the plant and extracted from the leaves. Part of their strategy for maintaining water balance. Here we can see some of the stages of the red mangrove reproductive cycle. Look here, you can see the flowers on the red mangrove. And they do require pollinators. After they've been pollinated, the fruit forms, and it looks like this. And because they undergo vivipary, the young starts to germinate right from the fruit. See it emerging from the fruit here. And then as they develop, they become longer propagules here until they're large enough and ready to be dropped to float away from the parent tree. Okay, this is a mangrove propagule. So that's propagule is just a general term for anything that can essentially start life. So technically root fragments and stuff could also be propagule. Mangroves do something called vivipary, which means the the seeds actually germinate on the mother plant, right? Rather than being planted and then germinating. So life has already started. This is already developed. These are actually pretty interesting. They're like, kind of designed to move through the water pretty efficiently, and they do float. They have cells inside called parenchyma that hold air in them that keep them floating. After a little while, they'll release the air and it'll cause the propagule to sink. And if the habitat is suitable, it'll actually extend roots out and try to establish there. If after a little while it doesn't seem suitable, the propagule will actually take air in again and cause the thing to float up, and then so that I can try somewhere else. So it's kind of a really cool evolutionary adaptation for dispersal. Now, most of the literature is saying that mangrove dispersal is not more than about 10 meters away. This is the case for sure in the Eastern Hemisphere, where the mangrove forests are considerably denser. The fruit drops, it's not really going to go very far. But in the Bahamas, there's a lot of evidence that the propagules got to go a lot farther, right? So if they're dropped and the tide is going out, it's possible that they move out to sea and then end up establishing in a different creek, right? But it's all about timing. So if the propagule drops when the tide is coming in, they're actually going to be carried into the back of the creek, right, establishing at the back. So we've done some research on this, and we're actually finding the dispersal distances to be 50 to 60 meters from the parent tree. We've actually tracked propagules and where they go. But what we've also seen is that 90% of the propagules that do drop stay in the creek they were born in. So it's a little bit of kind of an interesting thing. That can be problematic when we're talking about gene flow, because we really want different propagules moving from place to place so that they can cross-pollinate. So we don't have a lot of that, which is, again, problematic for Bahamian mangroves, where you get a large stand of mangroves that are all genetically very similar. All the little juvenile mangroves growing up in between the still roots of the parent trees. Little baby black mangrove. They drop fruit like a traditional angiosperm right on the ground and germinate in the spot. Now, all the mangroves out here are really, really small. They're dwarfed mangroves, and this is the same species you'll see in the Florida Everglades that grow stories tall. So the reason why they're so short out here is because of the salt water. At the back of the creek, as the water evaporates and the water moves out, the water that remains gets saltier and saltier, much saltier than the ocean. So salt stunts the growth of mangroves. Wherever you see large mangroves, particularly in the Caribbean, there's likely a freshwater source, whether it be freshwater coming from underneath like an island lens or a collection of rainwater, that kind of thing. Now they're very, very stunted, but they're also very, very old, okay? And the way we age them is a little different than trees we might see in the mid-Atlantic, where we can count tree rings and things like that. So there's been two methodologies that have been used to age them. One is counting leaf scars. So if you can come a little closer, you'll see on these trees, you'll see remnants of where leaves were, right? And so if you know how many leaves or flushes of leaves that are formed every year, you can sort of count backwards. We've also used the methods where we're measuring like branch increment over time, where we track them and measure them. And we actually have equated some of these trees, while they look really small, to being 40, 50, 60 years old. So it's really kind of impressive.
Mangroves are habitat for so much wildlife and fish. You'll come and see birds like herons, egrets, flamingos, osprey, kingbirds, warblers, and vireos. The tidal creeks are often nursery grounds for juvenile megafauna, like lemon sharks. They seek refuge and avoid predators in the creek while also doing some feeding. You may see lots of rays in the creek too, like the southern or yellow stingray, whiptails, or two-pair stingrays. There are many schools of fish in the creeks, including the checkered puffer, but you'll also find mahara, schoolmasters, wrasses, grunts, and sergeant majors. On the Mangrove Creek floor, you'll find lots of invertebrates, like crabs and juvenile conch.
This is a Cassiopeia jelly, an upside down jelly. So they love the mangrove creeks. They sit on the bottom of the creeks and extend and try to capture food. The jelly part on the top is non-stinging, but this is stinging and it'll feel like a scrape. The research shows that these increase in abundance with water pollution. So high nitrates and things like that, which, stimulates their food source. So you're going to see more of them. Now watch this in the water. They'll place it upside down. It figures out its orientation and then sits on the bottom.
Above the water surface, in the plants themselves, you'll find spiders or things like this, a mangrove snail.
Very common to see gastropods in the mangrove ecosystem. These are detritivores that feed on old biomass, old mangrove material, some of that organic matter that collects in the mud.
While being one of the most threatened ecosystems in the world, with only 7% of their original range remaining, it's important to remember why mangroves are valuable. They provide habitat and shelter for lots of species, often a place for nurseries. They provide shoreline protection from storms. And they accumulate and store a lot of carbon in the plants, but mostly in the mud. They are some of the best carbon sinks we've got, so we need to conserve them. I hope you enjoyed exploring this mangrove creek with us. Thanks for watching.